Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the deepest desperation. In the dusty railroad town of Cedar Ridge, a young woman's entire future crumbled in a single moment. Eleanor Whitmore had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, only to be rejected the moment he laid eyes on her. Standing alone on that wooden platform with her single trunk and nowhere to go, she turned to the only other. Man present, a wealthy rancher who'd come to collect his mail. Her plea was simple but heartbreaking. "Please marry me, sir. I have nowhere else to go." But why would a man who'd sworn off love after burying his wife accept such a desperate proposal? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Sterling stood frozen on the platform, his leather gloves halfway to his pocket, staring at the young woman who'd just spoken the most extraordinary words he'd heard in his 43 years. The mail he'd come to collect lay forgotten in his hands as he studied her face, pale but determined, with eyes that held both desperation and a peculiar kind of dignity. "Mom," he began, then stopped, unsure how to address such an unprecedented situation. Around them, the good people of Cedar Ridge had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle like moths to a lamp. He could hear their whispers starting already, could feel their eager eyes drinking in every detail of this unexpected drama. The woman, she couldn't be more than 25, stood straighter under his scrutiny. Her traveling dress, though, clean and carefully mended, showed the wear of a long journey. Her hands, clutched around a worn photograph, trembled slightly, but her gaze never wavered from his face. "I know how this must sound," she said, her voice carrying a cultured tone that spoke of education and better times. "But I've come 2,000 miles on a promise that's been broken. I sold everything, my parents' farm, their furniture, even my mother's china, to make this journey. That man," she gestured toward the empty space where her intended had fled, "took one look at me and ran. I have exactly $3 to my name, no family to return to, and nowhere to go." Jackson felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he'd thought himself immune to since Sarah's passing. His foreman, Wade Hutchins, chose that moment to stride up, having witnessed the scene from the general store. "Boss," Wade muttered, low enough that only Jackson could hear, "we best be getting back. Storm's coming in from the north." But Jackson couldn't move. Something in the woman's steady gaze held him rooted to the spot. He'd seen desperation before, had seen it in the eyes of soldiers during the war, in the faces of families during the drought of '81. But this was different. This woman wasn't just desperate. She was making a calculated gamble with the last coin she had to play. "What's your name?" he heard himself ask. "Eleanor Whitmore," she replied. "From Illinois, originally. My father was a school teacher before. The consumption took him. My mother followed 6 months later." Wade shifted impatiently beside him. "Jackson, you can't seriously be considering—" "I'm not considering anything," Jackson cut him off, though even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. His eyes dropped to the silver pocket watch in his vest, Sarah's last gift, engraved with her initials. 3 years she'd been gone. 3 years he'd kept the ranch running like clockwork, never deviating from the routine they'd established. Together, 3 years of keeping his heart as frozen as the ground that held her. Eleanor seemed to sense his hesitation. "I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Sterling. Jackson Sterling. Mr. Sterling." She lifted her chin a fraction. "I can work. I can cook, clean, keep accounts. I learned to manage a household from my mother, and I helped my father with his correspondence and records. I'm not afraid of hard work." "The Sterling Ranch don't need—" Wade began, but Jackson silenced him with a look. The crowd around them had grown. He recognized Mrs. Morrison, the banker's wife, already composing the gossip she'd spread at tomorrow's church social. Old Pete from the saloon was taking bets on what he'd do, and there was Reverend Clay, looking like he couldn't decide whether to offer comfort or condemnation. Jackson studied Eleanor again. Despite her dire circumstances, she hadn't wept, hadn't thrown herself at his feet, hadn't tried to manipulate him with feminine wiles. She'd stated her case plainly and waited for his verdict. There was steel in her spine, despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the platform. "I buried mine 3 years ago, and I've no intention of replacing her." He saw the hope dim in Eleanor's eyes, but she didn't look away. "I understand. However," he continued, and the word seemed to surprise him as much as anyone, "the ranch could use another pair of hands. If you're willing to work as you say, I can offer you employment, room, board, and fair wages for honest work. Nothing more." Wade made a sound of protest, but Eleanor stepped forward quickly, as if afraid he might change his mind. "I accept," she said simply. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." He nodded curtly, already wondering what madness had possessed him. "Wade, help Miss Whitmore with her trunk. We'll want to beat that storm." As Wade reluctantly moved to collect her meager belongings, Jackson allowed himself one last look at Eleanor Whitmore. She'd tucked the photograph into her pocket and stood waiting, dignified despite everything. For just a moment, he thought he saw Sarah's approving smile in his mind's eye, but he pushed the thought away. "This is temporary," he said, as much to himself as to her, "until you can make other arrangements." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, though something in her eyes suggested she was already planning to prove herself indispensable. As they made their way to the wagon, Jackson Sterling wondered if he'd just made the wisest or most foolish decision of his life. Time would tell, he supposed. Time always did. The journey to Sterling Ranch took them through 15 miles of prairie that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the gathering clouds. Eleanor sat rigid in the wagon bed, her trunk secured beside her, while Jackson and Wade occupied the bench. Seat up front. Neither man had spoken since leaving town, and the silence grew heavier with each passing mile. Eleanor's first glimpse of the ranch came as they crested a small rise. The sight took her breath away. The main house stood like a fortress against the vast sky, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that spoke of summer evenings and gentle conversation. Beyond it, she could see well-maintained barns, corrals filled with fine horses and cattle dotting the distant pastures. This was no struggling homestead. This was an empire built on years of hard work and careful management. "It's magnificent," she said softly, forgetting herself. Jackson glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. "Sarah designed the house, said if we were going to build something, it might as well last forever." The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them like a warning. Eleanor merely nodded, understanding the message clearly. She was entering another woman's domain. As they pulled up to the main house, the front door opened, and a severe-looking woman in her 50s emerged. Her grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her black dress was as stern as her expression. This, Eleanor realized with a sinking heart, must be the housekeeper. "Mrs. Hayworth," Jackson said as he climbed down from the wagon. "This is Miss Whitmore. She'll be helping with the household duties. Please see that she's settled in the servants' quarters." Mrs. Hayworth's eyes swept over Eleanor with the kind of assessment that missed nothing. "The servants' quarters, sir? Not the—" "The servants' quarters," Jackson repeated firmly. "She's an employee, nothing more." Eleanor felt the sting of the words, but kept her face carefully neutral. She'd known what she was accepting. Still, as she followed Mrs. Hayworth into the house, she couldn't help but notice the elegant furnishings, the polished floors, the paintings on the walls, all the signs of a home that had been deeply loved and carefully tended. "This way," Mrs. Hayworth said curtly, leading her through the kitchen and down a narrow hallway. "You'll take your meals with the ranch hands in the kitchen. Breakfast is at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. You'll help with the cooking and cleaning, though I'll warn you now, I run this household as Mrs. Sterling taught me, and I'll tolerate no changes to her methods." The room she was shown to was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the chicken coop. Eleanor set her trunk at the foot of the bed and tried not to think about the spacious bedroom upstairs that might have been hers under different circumstances. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayworth," she said quietly. "I'm grateful for the position." The older woman sniffed. "We'll see how grateful you are after a week of real work. City ladies usually don't last long out here." After she left, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. She pulled out the marriage contract from her trunk, the one she'd signed with such hope back in Illinois, promising to be a faithful wife to one Samuel Morrison of Cedar Ridge, Texas. The same Samuel Morrison who'd taken one look at her and fled the train station. She studied the document, wondering what he'd seen that had sent him running. Was she not pretty enough? Had her clothes betrayed her reduced circumstances? Or had he simply lost his nerve when faced with the reality of a mail-order bride? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She quickly tucked the contract away and opened it to find a young ranch hand holding a tray. "Mrs. Hayworth said you missed dinner," he said shyly. "Thought you might be hungry." Eleanor accepted the tray gratefully. "Thank you. I'm Eleanor. Tom, ma'am." "Tom Bradley." He shifted nervously. "Is it true what they're saying? That you asked Mr. Sterling to marry you right there at the station?" Heat flooded Eleanor's cheeks. "News travels fast. Faster than wildfire out here," Tom agreed. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I think Mr. Sterling did right by you. He's a good man, even if he's been walking around like a ghost since Miss Sarah passed." After Tom left, Eleanor ate her simple meal and tried to plan her next moves. She could hear the ranch hands gathering in the kitchen for supper, their voices carrying through the thin walls. They spoke of cattle prices, the coming storm, and, inevitably, of her arrival. "Banker Morrison's fit to be tied," one voice said. "Claims he's calling in loans all over the county. Says Sterling Ranch owes more than most. Jackson's good for it," another replied. "Always has been." "Maybe, but times are changing. Heard Morrison's got backing from some Eastern investors. They want land, not repayment." Eleanor filed this information away. If the ranch was in financial trouble, that might explain Jackson's reluctance to take on another mouth to feed. It also meant she needed to prove her worth quickly. As night fell, she unpacked her few belongings and prepared for bed. Through her window, she could see light burning in what must be Jackson's study. She wondered if he was regretting his impulsive decision to help her. From somewhere in the house came the sound of footsteps, steady, measured, pacing. Eleanor pulled her mother's quilt up to her chin and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't how she'd imagined her new life in Texas, but it was better than the alternatives. She had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and work for her hands. For now, that would have to be enough. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin, proving that Jackson Sterling had not made a mistake in taking her in. She would work harder than any servant he'd ever employed. She would make herself indispensable. And perhaps in time she might thaw the ice around his heart. But tonight, in the darkness of her small room, she allowed herself to grieve for the dreams that had died on that train platform, and to kindle the tiny spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. Eleanor rose in the pre-dawn darkness, her body protesting after a restless night on the narrow bed. Through her small window, she could see the faintest hint of light touching the eastern horizon. If she meant to prove herself, she'd need to be in that kitchen before Mrs. Hayworth. She dressed quickly in her simplest work dress and made her way through the quiet house. The kitchen was cold, the stove unlit, but Eleanor had helped her mother through enough Illinois winters to know her way around a temperamental fire. Soon she had flames crackling and water heating for coffee. As she explored the pantry for supplies, her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a leather-bound book tucked between the flour bin and the wall. She pulled it out carefully and gasped. Sarah's Kitchen was written across the cover in an elegant hand, and inside were pages upon pages of recipes, each annotated with personal notes. "Jackson's favorite," read one. "For Christmas morning," said another. Eleanor hesitated. Using these recipes felt like trespassing on sacred ground. But if she was going to win over this household, she needed every advantage. She selected a page marked Ranch Hand Breakfast and set to work. By the time Mrs. Hayworth arrived, Eleanor had biscuits in the oven, bacon sizzling, eggs ready to fry, and a pot of gravy simmering. The older woman stopped dead in the doorway, her face cycling through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been grief. "Where did you learn to make biscuits that way?" Mrs. Hayworth demanded. Eleanor chose honesty. "I found Mrs. Sterling's recipe book. I hope you don't mind, but I thought—" "You thought wrong." The housekeeper's voice was sharp. "That book isn't for the likes of you." "I meant no disrespect," Eleanor said quietly. "I only wanted to help." Before Mrs. Hayworth could respond, the ranch hands began filing in, drawn by the familiar smells. Their appreciative murmurs as they sat down to eat seemed to pain the housekeeper even more. "These biscuits," Tom Bradley said reverently, "they're just like Miss Sarah used to make." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Eleanor saw Jackson enter the kitchen and freeze, his eyes taking in the spread, the men's faces, and finally landing on the recipe book still open on the counter. "I apologize," Eleanor said quickly. "I shouldn't have—" "The men need feeding," Jackson interrupted, his voice carefully neutral. "If you can cook, then cook." He took his plate and retreated to the dining room, leaving Eleanor to wonder if she'd helped or harmed her cause. The morning passed in a blur of cleaning and organizing. Eleanor threw herself into the work, scrubbing floors that were already clean, polishing silver that already gleamed. It was near noon when Tom Bradley came running into the kitchen, his arm bleeding through a makeshift bandage. "Got caught on some barbed wire," he explained, grimacing. Mrs. Hayworth took one look and shook her head. "That needs the doctor. It's 15 miles to town." "I can help," Eleanor said. She'd helped her mother tend to injuries often enough. "If you have clean cloth and some whiskey for cleaning, I can stitch it." The men exchanged skeptical looks, but Tom was going pale. "Let her try," he said. Eleanor worked with steady hands, cleaning the wound and stitching it closed with neat, precise movements. Tom barely flinched, watching her work with growing respect. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked when she was done. "My mother was the closest thing to a doctor in our county," Eleanor explained, wrapping the final bandage. "She taught me what she could." Word of her medical skills spread quickly. By afternoon, she'd reset a dislocated finger and treated a persistent cough that had been plaguing one of the older hands. The men's initial wariness began to thaw, replaced by genuine appreciation. It was while searching for more medical supplies that Eleanor stumbled upon the ranch's account books in Jackson's study. The door had been left ajar, and she could see the ledgers spread across his desk. Unable to resist, she stepped inside for a closer look. The numbers told a stark story. The ranch was profitable, but barely. Several large loans were coming due, and the cattle prices had been falling. If something didn't change soon, Jackson would have to start selling off land or livestock. Finding everything you need, Eleanor jumped. Jackson stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said. "I was looking for bandages and saw the books. I didn't mean to pry." He studied her for a long moment. "And what did—" "You see, that Morrison holds too much of your debt," she said honestly, "and that you're land-rich but cash-poor with major payments coming due." His eyebrows rose slightly. "You understand accounts?" "My father taught mathematics. I helped him tutor students and kept his books." She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Mr. Sterling, I noticed you have water rights to Willow Creek that you're not fully utilizing. If you diverted some of that water to irrigate the south pasture, you could grow hay to sell instead of buying feed. The initial investment would be minimal, and the return—" "Miss Whitmore," he interrupted, but there was something different in his voice now. "Are you always this industrious? When I see a problem I can help solve, yes." That evening, as Eleanor served supper, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The men included her in their conversation, asking her opinion on everything from cooking to cattle. Even Mrs. Hayworth seemed slightly less hostile, though she still watched Eleanor with suspicious eyes. It was after the dishes were done that the confrontation came. Eleanor was returning the recipe book to its hiding place when Mrs. Hayworth cornered her in the pantry. "I know what you're doing," the older woman hissed. "Using her recipes, charming the men, getting close to Mr. Sterling. You think you can replace her?" "I'm not trying to replace anyone," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm just trying to earn my keep." "Sarah Sterling was a saint," Mrs. Hayworth continued. "She built this ranch alongside him, loved every board and nail. You're nothing but an opportunist, playing on his grief." The accusation stung because it hit too close to Eleanor's own fears. Was she taking advantage of a grieving man's momentary kindness? "That's enough, Mrs. Hayworth." Both women turned to find Jackson in the doorway. His face was stern, but Eleanor caught something else in his expression, a weariness that spoke of old pain. "Miss Whitmore is an employee of this ranch," he said quietly. "She'll be treated with the same respect we show any member of this household. Is that understood?" Mrs. Hayworth's face flushed. "Yes, sir." After she left, Jackson lingered. "The South Pasture irrigation idea," he said finally. "Write up a proposal, include costs and projected returns." Eleanor nodded, trying not to show her elation. "Yes, sir." He started to leave, then paused. "And Miss Whitmore? You may continue using Sarah's recipes. She always said good food was the heart of a home." As he walked away, Eleanor pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her own heart beat a little faster. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Ranch, she dared to hope that she might truly earn her place here. The following week brought an unwelcome visitor to Sterling Ranch. Eleanor was in the front parlor, polishing the already gleaming furniture, when she heard the approach of a carriage. Through the window, she saw a portly man in an expensive suit climbing down, briefcase in hand. Something about his self-satisfied expression made her uneasy. Jackson emerged from his study, his face grim. "Morrison," he said, though it wasn't a greeting. The banker, for this must be the Morrison the Hens had spoken of, smiled unctuously. "Jackson, I hope you've had time to consider my proposal." "There's nothing to consider. The payments aren't due for another month." "Ah, but circumstances change." Morrison pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I'm calling in the loan early. You have 30 days to pay in full or forfeit the ranch." Eleanor watched Jackson's hands clench. "You can't do that. The terms clearly state the terms include a clause about maintaining the property value. With you running a skeleton crew and taking in—" Morrison's eyes found Eleanor, and his smile grew predatory. "Questionable characters. I'd say you violated that clause." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her eyes down, continuing. "To dust the same spotless table." "Get out," Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet. Morrison tucked the foreclosure notice into Jackson's hands. 30 days, Sterling. Though I might be persuaded to extend that deadline if we could come to an arrangement." His gaze lingered on Eleanor again, the implication clear. After he left, Jackson stood frozen in the parlor, staring at the papers. Eleanor waited a moment before speaking. "How much is the loan?" He looked at her as if he'd forgotten she was there. "More than I can raise in 30 days. There must be something." "There isn't." His voice was flat, defeated. "I've already sold what I could after Sarah died. The medical bills." He trailed off, then seemed to remember himself. "This isn't your concern, Miss Whitmore." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She crept to the study and lit a lamp, spreading the ranch's financial records across the desk. There had to be something Jackson had overlooked, some asset he hadn't considered. As dawn approached, she found it. Buried in the original land deed were water rights that predated the town's incorporation. rights that could be sold or leased for significant money. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear the door open. "Miss Whitmore." She looked up to find Jackson in his nightshirt and robe, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I couldn't sleep," she explained. "I thought perhaps you thought you'd save us all." There was no mockery in it, just weary resignation. "I found something." She showed him the water rights documentation. "These predate the town charter. They're senior rights, which means they're worth a fortune to the town if they want to expand." Jackson sank into the chair beside her, studying the papers with growing amazement. "How did I miss this? You've been managing alone, trying to do everything Sarah helped with, plus your own work. It's no wonder some details slipped through." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Why are you doing this? You could leave, find work in town. Why stay and fight for a ranch that isn't yours?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "Because you gave me a chance when I had nothing, because your men have been kind to me, because—" She hesitated, then spoke the truth. "Because I've been without a home, Mr. Sterling, and I know how it feels to lose everything. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." Their eyes met and held, something unspoken passing between them. Then the moment shattered as they heard a carriage approaching. Morrison had returned, this time without the pretense of legitimate business. Eleanor watched from the window as he approached the kitchen entrance, clearly hoping to find her alone. "I'll handle this," Jackson said, but Eleanor shook her head. "Let me see what he wants. We need to know his real intentions." She met Morrison at the kitchen door, keeping her expression neutral. "Mr. Morrison?" "Ah, the lovely Miss Whitmore." His smile made her skin crawl. "I heard about your situation at the train station. Most unfortunate. How can I help you?" He stepped closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "I might ask the same thing. You see, I could make your life much easier. A woman like you needs protection, security. I could offer you a house in town, fine clothes, everything a lady desires. In exchange for—" His hand reached out to touch her cheek. She forced herself not to recoil. "I think we understand each other. Leave Sterling to his fate and come with me, or stay and watch him lose everything. Either way, you'll need a new situation soon." "I see." Eleanor stepped back. "Thank you for making your position clear, Mr. Morrison. My answer is no." His face darkened. "You'll regret this. When Sterling is ruined and you're back on the streets, remember you had a chance for comfort." After he left, Eleanor found Wade in the barn and told him everything. The foreman's weathered face grew stormy. "That snake," he muttered. "Miss Eleanor, you did right telling me. But you need to be careful now. Morrison's not a man who takes rejection well." "I can take care of myself." Wade studied her with something like approval. "I'm beginning to believe that. You know, when you first arrived, I thought Jackson had lost his mind. But you've been good for this place. Good for him too, though he's too stubborn to admit it." That evening, Eleanor presented her findings about the water rights to Jackson formally. He listened intently, asked intelligent questions, and finally agreed to meet with the town council about leasing arrangements. "This could save the ranch," he said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." "I don't want thanks," Eleanor replied. "I want to help. We have 30 days to fight this, and I intend to use every one of them." Something shifted in Jackson's expression then. A softening, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "We," he repeated. "Yes, I suppose it is we now, isn't it?" As Eleanor retired to her small room that night, she realized that somewhere between her desperate plea at the train station and this moment, she'd stopped thinking of Sterling Ranch as just a temporary shelter. It was becoming home, and she would fight to save it, not just for Jackson, but for herself and the future she was beginning to envision here. The next morning, Eleanor found Jackson waiting for her in his study, the desk cleared except for the water rights documents and fresh paper. "If we're going to present this to the town council," he said without preamble, "we need to be thorough. They'll have questions, objections. We need answers for all of them." Eleanor settled into the chair across from him, trying not to notice how the morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. They worked side by side through breakfast, their heads bent together over maps and calculations. When Mrs. Hayworth brought coffee, she pursed her lips at the sight, but said nothing. "Your handwriting is excellent," Jackson observed, watching. Eleanor draft a formal proposal. "You really did help your father with his work." "Every evening after school," Eleanor confirmed. "He said education was the only thing no one could take away from you. I suppose he was right. It served me well here." Jackson leaned back, studying her. "Tell me about them. Your parents." It was the first truly personal question he'd asked. Eleanor set down her pen, considering. "Father was brilliant but impractical. He'd give away his last penny to help a student who couldn't afford books. Mother was the one who kept us fed and clothed, taking in mending and preserving food for sale. They loved each other deeply. How did you end up?" He gestured vaguely, encompassing her journey to Texas. "After they died, I tried to keep the farm going alone. But a woman farming by herself, the neighbors didn't approve. The bank wouldn't extend credit. When I saw the advertisement for mail order brides, it seemed like a chance for a fresh start." She smiled ruefully. "I suppose I should have known it was too good to be true." "His loss," Jackson said quietly, then seemed surprised by his own words. They returned to work, but the atmosphere had shifted. As the hours passed, Jackson shared stories of building the ranch, of the early years when he and Sarah lived in a one-room cabin while constructing the main house. Eleanor found herself laughing at his description of Sarah chasing a stubborn rooster with a broom, then saw the pain that flickered across his face at the memory. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know it must be difficult, talking about her. It's strange," Jackson admitted. "For 3 years no one's dared mention her name around me. But somehow, when you do it, it doesn't hurt the same way." He shook his head. "Wade's right. You are good for this place." That afternoon, while Jackson rode out to inspect the south pasture, Eleanor retreated to her room to air out her trunk. At the very bottom, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, lay her mother's wedding dress. She lifted it out, shaking out the folds of ivory silk. It was old-fashioned but beautifully made, with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar. And cuffs. Planning another proposal, Eleanor spun to find Mrs. Hayworth in her doorway. But for once, the older woman's expression held curiosity rather than hostility. "It was my mother's," Eleanor explained. "I brought it hoping—" She trailed off, unable to voice the dreams that seemed foolish now. Mrs. Hayworth stepped into the room, her fingers reaching out to touch the fabric. "It's lovely. Sarah's was similar, all lace and pearls. She looked like an angel in it." Her voice softened. "I helped raise her, you know. Came to work for her parents when she was just 10. When she married Jackson, I came with her. You must miss her terribly. Every day." Mrs. Hayworth sat heavily on Eleanor's bed. "I've been unkind to you, haven't I?" "You are protecting her memory, I understand." The housekeeper studied her shrewdly. "You're in love with him." Eleanor's cheeks flamed. That's not—" "Child, I've got eyes. The way you look at him, the way you've thrown yourself into saving this ranch. And him, well, he hasn't looked at a woman since Sarah died, but he looks at you. He's still in love with his wife," Eleanor said quietly. "Of course he is. You don't stop loving someone just because they're gone. But Sarah wouldn't want him to stop living." Mrs. Hayworth stood, smoothing her skirts. "The harvest. Dance is next week. You should go. The harvest dance." Eleanor had heard the hands talking about it, the biggest social event of the season, when all the neighboring ranches gathered to celebrate the end of summer. She hadn't even considered attending. That evening, as if reading her thoughts, Tom Bradley brought up the subject at supper. "Boss, you planning to go to the Miller's dance this year?" Jackson looked up from his plate. "Hadn't thought about it." "You should go," Wade said firmly. "Show Morrison and his cronies that Sterling Ranch isn't beaten. Besides, the men have been working hard. They deserve a celebration. I suppose you're right?" Jackson's gaze found Eleanor. Miss Whitmore, you'll accompany us, of course. The whole household attends. Eleanor's heart skipped. I wouldn't want to presume. It's not presumption. You're part of Sterling Ranch now. The words carried more weight than he perhaps intended, and a hush fell over the table. Later, as Eleanor helped clear the dishes, Jackson lingered in the kitchen. I meant what I said, about you being part of this place. Thank you, she managed. That means more than you know. He stepped closer, and for a moment she thought, but then Tom burst through the door. Boss! Rustlers hitting the north pasture. They're after the breeding stock. Jackson's demeanor changed instantly. The rancher replacing the man. How many? 6, maybe 7. They're armed. Saddle the horses. Wade, get the rifles. He turned to Eleanor. You and Mrs. Hayworth lock the doors and stay inside. If we're not back by dawn, ride to town for the sheriff. Eleanor wanted to protest, to help somehow, but she saw the steel in his eyes and nodded. As the men rode out, she and Mrs. Hayworth secured the house and settled in to wait. The rifle Jackson had left them propped by the door. He'll be fine, Mrs. Hayworth said, but Eleanor heard the worry beneath the words. Of course he will, Eleanor agreed, though her hands trembled as she made coffee to keep them awake. As the hours crawled by, the two women found themselves talking about Sarah, about Jackson, about the ranch and its future. By the time hoofbeats announced the men's return, an understanding had grown between them. Jackson entered the kitchen exhausted but triumphant. We got them, and the cattle are safe. Without thinking, Eleanor flew to him, checking for injuries. You're hurt, she said, spotting blood on his sleeve, just a graze. But he didn't pull away from her ministrations, and when their eyes met, something electric passed between them. Mrs. Hayworth cleared her throat. I'll just go check on the men, she said, leaving them alone. Eleanor finished bandaging Jackson's arm, achingly aware of his proximity. I was worried, she admitted. Were you? His voice was rough with exhaustion and something else. His hand came up to cup her cheek, and for a heartbeat she thought he would kiss her. Then he stepped back, the wall slamming back into place. Thank you for tending my arm. You should get some rest. Eleanor nodded, understanding that whatever was growing between them, Jackson wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. But as she walked to her room, she touched her cheek where his hand had been and smiled. Progress came slowly with a man like Jackson Sterling, but it did come. Tomorrow they would present their proposal to save the ranch. Tonight, she had hope. For the ranch, for Jackson, and for possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Jackson left at dawn with Wade and 4 of his best men to track the rustlers to their hideout and ensure they faced justice. Before departing, he'd pulled Eleanor aside in the pre-dawn darkness. I need you to manage things here, he'd said quietly. Mrs. Hayworth knows the household, but you understand the books. If Morrison comes around, I'll handle him, Eleanor assured him. Just come back safely. He'd looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and rode away. Now, as the morning stretched toward noon, Eleanor tried to focus on the ledgers spread before her. She was deep in calculations when Tom Bradley burst through the study door. Miss Eleanor, riders coming, lots of them. It's Morrison with hired guns. Eleanor's blood ran cold. With Jackson gone and only a skeleton crew remaining, they were vulnerable. She stood, squaring her shoulders. How many? 8, maybe 10, all armed. Get everyone into the main house. Bar the windows. She grabbed the rifle Jackson had left and checked it was loaded. Where's Mrs. Hayworth? Already getting the ammunition from the storage room. Eleanor had barely reached the front porch when Morrison and his men rode up. The banker sat his horse with smug satisfaction, flanked by rough-looking hired guns. Miss Whitmore, he called out. I heard Sterling's away. Thought I'd check on the property I'll soon own. This property isn't yours yet, Eleanor replied steadily, the rifle held loosely but ready in her hands. And you're trespassing. Morrison's face darkened. You dare point a gun at me? I dare defend what's mine to protect. Yours? He laughed unpleasantly. You're nothing but a servant here, girl. Though my offer still stands. Come with me now, and I'll set you up properly in town. My answer hasn't changed. Morrison nodded to his men. Search the place. I want to know what assets we'll be acquiring. As the hired guns dismounted, Eleanor raised the rifle. One more step and I'll shoot. You wouldn't dare, Morrison scoffed. Eleanor's answer was to fire into the dirt, inches from his horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating him. The next one won't be a warning. Behind her, she heard windows opening as the remaining ranch hands took position. They were outnumbered, but they had the defensive advantage. It was then that Eleanor remembered something. Jackson's army discharge papers she'd seen while organizing. If he'd been an officer, he would have taught his men tactics. She called out, loud enough for the hands to hear, "Remember what Mr. Sterling taught you about defensive positions. Tom, you take the east corner like in the war games." Tom caught. Quickly, "Yes, ma'am. Johnson, you got the west flank like we practiced." The bluff worked. Morrison's hired guns exchanged uncertain looks. They'd expected easy pickings, not a trained defensive force. While Morrison tried to rally his men, Eleanor noticed movement from the barn. Mrs. Hayworth and two of the older hands were flanking the intruders, having slipped out the back. The housekeeper might be getting on in years, but she held a shotgun with practiced ease. "Seems you're surrounded, Mr. Morrison," Eleanor called out. "I suggest you leave, now." But Morrison had noticed something else, smoke rising from the direction of the south pasture. "Set the hayfield on fire, boys," he shouted. "Let's see how brave she is when the ranch burns." Horror flooded through Eleanor. If the fire spread to the dry grasslands, it could destroy everything. But before panic could take hold, she heard thunder. No, hoofbeats. Lots of them. Jackson appeared over the rise, riding hard with not just his own men, but what looked like half the county behind him. The Millers, the Bradshaws, the Keens, all the neighboring ranchers who'd heard about Morrison's attack and come to help. The bankers' hired guns took one look at the approaching force and threw down their weapons. Morrison himself tried to wheel his horse around, but Jackson cut him off. "Going somewhere, Morrison?" Jackson's voice was deadly calm. "Sterling, your girl pulled a gun on me. I'll have her arrested." "My girl?" Jackson dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his pistol. "You mean the woman who just defended my home against armed intruders? The woman you've been harassing and threatening?" Eleanor felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words, but there was no time to savor it. "Jackson, the south field, they set it on fire." He nodded grimly. "We saw the smoke. The Millers are already working to contain it." His attention returned to Morrison. "As for you, the sheriff's on his way. Turns out those rustlers from last night were quite talkative about who hired them." Morrison's face went white. "You can't prove anything." "Can't I?" Jackson pulled out a paper. "Signed confession. You've been hiring rustlers to hit all the ranches you hold loans on, trying to devalue the properties. That's fraud, Morrison, and attempted arson, and conspiracy." As if on cue, Sheriff Coleman rode up with his deputies. "Josiah Morrison, you're under arrest." As Morrison was led away in chains, still blustering threats, Jackson turned to Eleanor. His eyes swept over her, checking for injuries, before fixing on the rifle in her hands. "You defended the ranch," he said softly. "You asked me to manage things," she replied. "That included keeping it safe." "With a bluff about war games?" Eleanor smiled slightly. "I found your discharge papers while organizing. Cavalry officer, decorated. For valor, I figured you might have taught the men some tactics." "You figured right." He stepped closer. "You could have left with Morrison. He would have kept you safe, comfortable." "Comfortable isn't the same as home," Eleanor said simply. Something shifted in Jackson's expression. He reached out, taking the rifle from her hands and setting it aside. "Eleanor," he began, then stopped, struggling for words. Mrs. Hayworth chose that moment to bustle up. "Mr. Sterling, the fire's under control. The Millers saved most of the field." She looked between them with knowing eyes. "I'll just go organize some food for all these folks who came to help." As she left, Jackson found his voice again. "What you did today, defending the ranch, standing up to Morrison, rallying the men, Sarah would have done the same." "I'm not trying to be Sarah," Eleanor said gently. No, he agreed. You're Eleanor, and that's... He took a breath. That's exactly who I want you to be. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Around them, the ranch hands and neighbors were dealing with Morrison's captured men, putting out the last of the fire, restoring order. But for Eleanor and Jackson, the world had narrowed to just this moment. I have something to ask you, Jackson said. But not here, not like this. After the harvest dance, when things are settled, will you wait? Eleanor's heart was pounding, but she managed to nod. I'll wait. He smiled then, the first truly unguarded smile she'd seen from him. Good. Now let's go thank our neighbors, and Eleanor, you're done with the servants' quarters. Mrs. Hayworth will prepare a proper room in the main house. You've more than earned it. As they walked together toward the gathered crowd, Eleanor felt the last walls between them beginning to crumble. She defended his home, and in doing so had finally claimed her place in it. Not as a servant, not as an employee, but as something altogether more precious. The next morning found Eleanor and Jackson in the courthouse basement, searching through dusty property records. Word of Morrison's arrest had spread quickly, and several other ranchers had come forward with suspicions about their own loans and the rustling that had plagued them. If we can prove Morrison's been manipulating property values across the county, Jackson explained, pulling another heavy tome from the shelf, we might be able to invalidate all his loans. Eleanor sneezed as dust billowed from the pages. These records go back to Spanish colonial times. There might be something here about the original land grants. They worked in companionable silence, occasionally sharing discoveries. Eleanor found herself stealing glances at Jackson, noting how he'd rolled up his sleeves, how his brow furrowed in concentration. When their hands brushed reaching for the same document, neither pulled away immediately. Here, Eleanor breathed suddenly. Jackson, look at this. She'd found a leather portfolio tucked behind other documents, its pages yellowed with age. Inside was an original Spanish land grant for what was now Sterling Ranch, complete with detailed water rights that extended far beyond what current records showed. This predates the town charter by 50 years, Jackson said, studying the document. These water rights are senior to everything else in the county, which means the town needs your permission to use any water from Willow Creek. Eleanor added, Morrison's been collecting payments from the town for water rights that weren't his to sell. Judge Patterson, who'd been sympathetic but cautious about moving against Morrison, examined the document carefully. This changes everything. If this is authenticated, and I believe it is, then Mr. Morrison has been committing fraud on a massive scale. There's more, Eleanor said. She'd continued searching while they talked and found a ledger hidden in the same portfolio. Look at these entries. Morrison's been skimming from the town's water payments for years, claiming the money went to various water rights holders. The judge's face darkened, including payments that should have gone to Sterling Ranch. We need to call a town meeting, Jackson decided. Make all of this public before Morrison's friends can bury it. The meeting was set for that evening, and word spread like wildfire. By 7 o'clock, the town hall was packed. Ranchers, townspeople, and business owners all crowded in, eager to hear what had been discovered. Eleanor sat beside Jackson at the front table, the documents spread before them. She changed into her best dress, not fancy, but respectable, and tried to ignore the whispers about Sterling's mail-order bride that followed them. Jackson stood to address the crowd. Most of you know why we're here. Josiah Morrison has been arrested for conspiracy and fraud. What you don't know is how deep his corruption goes. He laid out the evidence methodically, the hired rustlers, the manipulated property values, the false water rights. Eleanor watched the crowd's faces shift from skepticism to anger as the full scope of Morrison's crimes became clear. But that's not all, Jackson continued. Miss Whitmore has discovered something else. Eleanor rose, her knees only slightly, unsteady. Public speaking had never been her strong suit, but these people deserved the truth. Mr. Morrison has been stealing from all of you, she said clearly. The town has been paying for water rights that belong to Sterling Ranch. Morrison pocketed the difference, money that should have gone to town improvements, to your schools and roads. An angry murmur ran through the crowd. Mayor Collins stood up. How much are we talking about? Over 10 years? Eleanor consulted her calculations. Close to $50,000. The explosion of outrage was immediate, but through the noise, a familiar voice cut through. Morrison himself, flanked by guards but still defiant. You're going to believe her? He sneered. A desperate woman who threw herself at Sterling at the train station. She's obviously manipulated these documents to trap him into marriage. Eleanor felt heat flood her face, but before she could respond, Jackson was on his feet. That's enough, he said, his voice carrying the authority of his military days. Miss Whitmore came to my ranch seeking honest work, nothing more. She's proven herself through intelligence, courage, and integrity. She defended my home against your hired thugs. She uncovered your crimes when no one else could. And if anyone's been manipulated here, Morrison, it's the good people of this town by you. He turned to address the crowd. Yes, Miss Whitmore arrived, here under unusual circumstances, but she's shown more character in these few weeks than you've shown in a lifetime, Morrison. And I'm proud. His voice softened, his eyes finding Eleanor's. I'm proud to stand beside her. The crowd erupted in supportive applause. Eleanor blinked back tears, overwhelmed by Jackson's public defense. Morrison made one last desperate play. Fine, but you still owe me $30,000, Sterling. That loan stands, and it's due in 2 weeks. Actually, a new voice interjected, it doesn't. Everyone turned to see Mr. Hartley, the federal prosecutor who'd arrived that morning. Mr. Morrison, all contracts obtained through fraudulent means are null and void. Furthermore, the money you stole from the town, that will be seized as restitution. Every rancher you cheated will be compensated. As Morrison was led away, still protesting, the townspeople surged forward. Men shook Jackson's hand, women embraced Eleanor, and apologies flowed for how she'd been treated. You saved us all, Mrs. Collins said, pressing Eleanor's hands. I'm ashamed of how we gossiped about you when you first arrived. Later, as the crowd finally dispersed, Jackson and Eleanor found themselves alone in the empty hall. The gas lamps cast a warm glow, and for a moment neither spoke. Thank you, Eleanor said finally, for what you said about me. I meant every word. Jackson stepped closer. Eleanor, Mr. Sterling. Tom Bradley burst through the doors. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a telegram from the governor. He's sending a whole team to investigate Morrison's other dealings. Seems this goes all the way to Austin. Jackson sighed, the moment broken. I'll be right there, Tom. After the young man left, Jackson turned back to Eleanor with a rueful smile. We seem destined to be interrupted. The harvest dance is tomorrow, Eleanor reminded him. You said after the dance. I did. He took her hand, raising it to his lips in an unexpectedly courtly gesture. Until then, Miss Whitmore. Eleanor floated back to the ranch, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched. Tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough. The morning of the harvest dance dawned clear and bright. Eleanor woke to find the entire ranch in a flutter of preparation. Even with Morrison behind bars and the immediate threat past, there was still work to be done consolidating the evidence. Against him, in Jackson's study, she found him meeting with other ranchers who'd come forward with their own stories of Morrison's manipulation. Walter Keene was showing loan documents with suspicious terms, while Ben Miller described cattle losses that now seemed too convenient. He had us all dancing to his tune, Keene said bitterly, paying higher interest than we should have, selling stock at losses to make payments. Eleanor quietly took notes as each man told his story. By mid-morning, they had enough evidence to show Morrison had been systematically destroying the county's ranching community for his own gain. It was then that Marshal Hayes arrived from Austin with news that changed everything. We've been investigating Morrison's connections back east, he announced. Turns out he's been working with a syndicate that's been buying up Western land through similar schemes. We intercepted a telegram. They're sending someone to break him out tonight during the dance when everyone's distracted." The room erupted in concerned voices, but Jackson raised his hand for quiet. "Then we'll be ready for them. Marshal, how many men can you spare?" "4 deputies, but if they're sending professionals, they won't expect the whole county to be armed and ready," Jackson interrupted. His military bearing was fully evident now as he began organizing the defense. "Ben, you and your boys watch the north road. Walter, take the east." Eleanor watched him deploy the ranchers like troops, using his knowledge of the terrain and tactics. When he assigned her to coordinate communications from the ranch, she started to protest. "I need you here," he said firmly but gently. "Someone has to keep track of all the moving pieces, and you're the only one I trust to do it right." She understood. This was his way of keeping her safe while still including her in the fight. "I'll have Mrs. Hayworth help me set up a command post in the kitchen." As the day progressed, tension built across the county. But when evening came, everyone dressed for the dance as if nothing was amiss. Eleanor stood before her mirror in her mother's wedding dress, the only formal gown she owned, which she'd altered slightly for the occasion. Mrs. Hayworth appeared in her doorway. "You look lovely, dear. Sarah's jewelry would complement that dress perfectly. May I?" She fastened a simple pearl necklace around Eleanor's throat. "There. Now you're ready to face whatever comes." The Miller Ranch was ablaze with lanterns when they arrived. Despite the underlying tension, the atmosphere was festive. The barn had been cleared for dancing, tables groaned with food, and a small band was tuning their instruments. Jackson helped Eleanor down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. They'd barely entered the barn when a commotion arose outside. One of the watchers had spotted riders approaching, too many to be late guests. Jackson pressed Eleanor's hand briefly, then moved to coordinate the defense. What followed was swift and decisive. The syndicate's hired guns rode straight into the trap Jackson had set. Ranchers emerged from hidden positions, weapons trained on the intruders. The would-be rescuers found themselves surrounded and outmanned, but in the confusion, one man slipped through, heading not for the jail but for the barn where the women and children had gathered. Eleanor saw him first, recognizing the cold professionalism in his movements. He was heading for the banker's wife, probably to use as a hostage. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped into his path. "I don't think so," the man sneered, reaching for his gun. But Eleanor had learned a thing or two in her weeks at the ranch. She grabbed a serving fork from the nearest table and threw it with the accuracy her father had taught her hunting. It caught the man in the shoulder, making him stumble. That was all the time Jackson needed. He appeared like an avenging angel, taking the man down with a single precise blow. Around them, the other syndicate members were being rounded up by the combined force of lawmen and ranchers. "Are you hurt?" Jackson demanded, his hands running over Eleanor's arms as if checking for injuries. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Is it over?" Marshal Hayes approached, grinning broadly. "It's over. We got them all, and with Morrison's telegram records, we can trace this conspiracy all the way back to New York. The syndicate is finished. The danger passed. The dance resumed, with even greater enthusiasm." Eleanor found herself whirled from partner to partner, each rancher wanting to thank the woman who'd helped save their community. But her eyes kept finding Jackson, waiting for the moment he'd claim his dance. It came as the band struck up a slow waltz. Jackson appeared at her elbow, bowing formally. "Miss Whitmore, may I have this dance?" She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor. They moved together as if they'd been dancing for years, perfectly in sync. "You threw a serving fork at an armed man," Jackson murmured, a note of amusement mixing with awe in his voice. It seemed like the thing to do at the time. He laughed, a real full laugh that transformed his face. "God help me, Eleanor, you're going to turn my hair completely gray. Would that be so bad?" she asked, daringly touching one of the silver threads at his temple. His expression grew serious. "Eleanor, I need to say something before I lose my nerve," He guided her to the edge of the dance floor, to a quiet corner beneath the stars. "When you arrived at that train station, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me. You saved my ranch, my community, but most of all, you saved me from becoming a ghost in my own life." Eleanor's heart was racing. "Jackson, I loved Sarah with all my heart," he continued. "Part of me always will, but she's gone, and I'm still here. And I find myself wanting to live again, to really live, not just exist. With you." He dropped to one knee, and Eleanor gasped as he pulled out a ring. Not Sarah's ring, but a new one, simple and elegant. "Eleanor Whitmore, you came to me desperate and alone, asking for my help. Now I'm the one asking, will you marry me? Not because you need shelter or I need a housekeeper, but because I love you and can't imagine my life without you." Tears streaming down her face, Eleanor sank to her knees beside him, not caring about her dress or the people watching. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Jackson, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then cupped her face and kissed her, their first kiss, sweet and full of promise. Around them, the entire gathering erupted in cheers. Mrs. Hayworth was openly weeping. "About time," she declared to anyone who'd listen. "That boy's been sleepwalking for 3 years." As Jackson helped Eleanor to her feet, she noticed him touch his pocket where Sarah's watch rested. But when he looked at Eleanor, his eyes held only joy and anticipation for their future. "No more interruptions," he promised. "We'll be married as soon as Reverend Clay can arrange it." Eleanor laughed, glowing with happiness. "I'll hold you too." In that, Mr. Sterling. They rejoined the dance, but now they moved as an engaged couple, their love story already becoming legend in Cedar Ridge. The tale of a desperate mail-order bride and a grieving rancher who saved each other. 3 days after the harvest dance, Jackson found Eleanor in his study, now their study, working on correspondence from grateful ranchers. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the sparkle of her engagement ring. The marshal "Sent word," he said, setting a telegram on the desk. "Morrison's been transferred to federal prison. He'll spend the next 20 years breaking rocks instead of breaking ranches." Eleanor looked up with satisfaction. "Good, though I almost pity him. He had everything, wealth, position, respect, and threw it all away for greed. Speaking of throwing things away," Jackson pulled out a folded paper from his jacket. "I've been working on something." Eleanor recognized his careful handwriting, but gasped when she read the heading, "Marriage Contract between Jackson Sterling and Eleanor Whitmore." "Jackson, we don't need— Please, let me finish." He sat beside her, taking her hands. "You came here with a contract that promised you security in exchange for duty. I want to give you something better." Eleanor read through tears, as each line revealed not legal obligations, but promises of love. "I, Jackson Sterling, promise to honor Eleanor not as property or convenience, but as my equal partner in all things. I promise to share not just my home but my dreams, not just my name but my heart. I promise that her voice will be heard in all decisions, her wisdom valued in all endeavors." "Oh, Jackson," she whispered. "There's more," he said softly. "I promise to speak Sarah's name when memory moves me without guilt, knowing that Eleanor understands love multiplies rather than divides. I promise to build our future while honoring our pasts." Eleanor was openly crying now. "It's beautiful, but I have conditions of my own." She took the pen from his hand and began writing below his words. "I, Eleanor Whitmore, promise to stand beside Jackson in drought and plenty, in joy and sorrow. I promise to be not a shadow of what came before, but a light toward what lies ahead. I promise to love the man he was, the man he is, and the man he's still becoming." They signed it together, their hands touching on the pen. Jackson carefully blotted the ink, then set the document aside. "Now then," he said, his tone lighter, "Mrs. Hayworth informs me that a proper wedding takes at least 2 weeks to arrange. Apparently, there are flowers to order, food to prepare, a dress to be made." "I have my mother's dress," Eleanor interrupted, "which is lovely, but Mrs. Hayworth insists you need a new one." Something about not starting our marriage in a dress. Meant for another man. He grinned at her expression. Don't argue with her. I've learned it's futile. Besides, the entire county wants to celebrate with us. We've become something of a symbol of hope, I'm told. Over the following days, Eleanor discovered he was right. Wedding gifts arrived daily. Handmade quilts, preserved foods, furniture carved by grateful neighbors. The local seamstress insisted on creating her wedding dress at no charge, calling it an honor to dress the woman who'd saved their community. But the most touching moment came when Eleanor was sorting through the gifts. At the bottom of a basket, wrapped in brown paper, was Sarah Sterling's recipe book. A note in Mrs. Hayworth's hand read, "She would want you to have this. Make it yours now." Eleanor was still clutching the book when Jackson found her. "Are you all right?" "Everyone's being so kind," she managed. "I never expected—" "You gave them hope," Jackson said simply. "You showed them that even in the darkest moments, courage and determination can prevail. That's worth more than you." "No!" The evening before the wedding, Jackson took Eleanor to a quiet spot overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I need to tell you something," he said. "This morning, I went to Sarah's grave." Eleanor's breath caught, but Jackson continued. "I told her about you, about how you've brought life back to this place, how you make me want to be better than I am. And Eleanor, I swear I felt her blessing, like she was saying it was time." "I wish I could have known her," Eleanor said softly. "She would have liked you. You're both fighters, both devoted to those you love." He pulled her close. "Tomorrow, you become my wife. Are you ready for that?" Eleanor thought of her journey, from the desperate woman on the train platform to this moment, standing beside a man who loved her truly. "I've been ready since the day you said, 'however' instead of 'no.'" Jackson laughed, remembering. "Best decision I ever made, even if I didn't know it then." "What made you change your mind? That day at the station?" He considered. "You didn't beg. You didn't cry or manipulate. You just stood there with quiet dignity and asked for a chance. Sarah was like that, steel wrapped in silk. I think I recognized it in you even then. And now I know you're nothing like her and everything like her, and entirely yourself." He kissed her forehead. "And that's exactly who I want to marry." They stood together as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge. Tomorrow would bring vows and celebrations, the official beginning of their life together. But here, in this quiet moment, Eleanor felt their real marriage had already begun, built on trust, tested by fire, and sealed with promises more binding than any legal document. "I love you, Jackson Sterling," she said. "And I love you, Eleanor." "Whitmore, soon to be Eleanor Sterling," he smiled. "Has a nice sound, doesn't it?" "Perfect," she agreed, and meant it in every way. Dawn, on her wedding day, found Eleanor at the window of her room, no longer the servants' quarters, but a proper bedroom in the main house. The sky was painting itself in the same rose and gold as that first morning when she'd stood on the train. Platform, desperate and alone. How much had changed in such a short time. Mrs. Hayworth bustled in with coffee and breakfast. "None of that now," she said, seeing Eleanor's thoughtful expression. "Today's for joy, not melancholy reflection." "I was just thinking how different this is from what I imagined," Eleanor said. "When I left Illinois, I thought I'd be marrying a stranger for survival. Instead, you're marrying a good man for love." Mrs. Hayworth's eyes were suspiciously bright. Sarah would be so pleased. She always worried about Jackson being alone. The morning flew by in a whirl of preparation. The seamstress arrived with Eleanor's dress, ivory silk, with delicate embroidery, simple but elegant. The women of Cedar Ridge descended like a benevolent army, arranging flowers, fixing hair, offering advice and blessings. "Something old," Mrs. Collins said, fastening an antique brooch to Eleanor's dress. "Something new, your dress," added Mrs. Miller. "Something borrowed." Mrs. Hayworth produced a delicate handkerchief. This was Sarah's grandmother's. She'd want it to stay in the family. And something blue. Young Mary Keene shyly offered a ribbon for Eleanor's bouquet, When Eleanor finally stood before the mirror in her complete ensemble, she hardly recognized herself. Gone was the desperate woman from the train platform. In her place stood a bride, radiant, confident, loved. Jackson had insisted on holding the ceremony at the train station, transforming the platform where their story began. As Eleanor's carriage approached, she gasped at the transformation. White, bunting draped the depot, flowers adorned every surface, and what seemed like the entire county had gathered to witness their union. Tom Bradley helped her down from the carriage. "Mr. Sterling's waiting for you, Miss Eleanor. Fair warning. He looks nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs." Eleanor smiled, her own nerves settling. If Jackson was nervous too, they'd face it together. The crowd parted as she made her way to the platform. There at the end, exactly where she'd first seen him, stood Jackson. He wore his best suit, his silver-touched hair gleaming in the morning sun. When their eyes met, his face transformed with a smile of such pure joy that Eleanor felt tears threaten. Wade stood beside him as best man, beaming proudly. Reverend Clay waited with his prayer book, and the entire scene was framed by the vast Texas sky. Eleanor walked alone down the makeshift aisle. She had no one to give her away, and that seemed fitting. She was giving herself, freely and gladly, to the man who'd saved her when he thought he was past saving. When she reached Jackson, he took her hands, and she felt their slight tremble. "You're beautiful," he whispered. "You're not so bad yourself." She whispered back, winning a chuckle from those close enough to hear. Reverend Clay began the ceremony, his words carrying across the hushed crowd. When he asked who gave this woman in marriage, Eleanor spoke for herself. "I come of my own free will, with the blessing of those who've gone before and the hope of those gathered here." Jackson's vows were simple but heartfelt. "Eleanor, you arrived in my life like dawn after the longest night. You brought warmth to a cold house, hope to a failing ranch, and love to a heart I thought was closed forever. I promise to cherish you, to stand beside you, to share my whole life with you from this day forward." Eleanor's voice was steady, as she gave her own vows. "Jackson, you offered shelter to a stranger and found a partner instead. You gave me a chance when I had nothing, and in return I offer you everything, my heart, my strength, my devotion. I promise to build our future while honoring our past, to be your companion in all things, to love you through whatever comes." When Reverend Clay pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson cupped Eleanor's face gently. "No more interruptions," he murmured, and kissed her as the crowd erupted in cheers. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had seen. Tables groaned under the weight of food, contributed by every family. Musicians played, children ran between the dancers, and even the most stoic ranchers were seen wiping their eyes. During the feast, Jackson stood to address their guests. 6 weeks ago, on this very platform, a remarkable woman asked me for help. I thought I was offering charity. Instead, I received a gift beyond measure. Eleanor saved our ranch, helped save our community, and most importantly, saved me from a half-life of grief and isolation." He raised his glass. "To my wife, Eleanor Sterling, proof that sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the greatest blessings." The toast was drunk with enthusiasm, and Eleanor found herself passed from one group of well-wishers to another. But through it all, she was aware of Jackson. His hand on her back, his smile when their eyes met, the solid presence of her husband beside her. As evening approached, they shared a quiet moment away from the crowd. The train that had brought Eleanor to Cedar Ridge sat on the tracks, ready for its evening departure. "Any regrets?" Jackson asked. "Your life would have been simpler if you'd gotten back on that train 6 weeks ago." Eleanor laughed. "Simpler, maybe, but not better. Never better." She leaned into his embrace. "What about you? You could have remained safely alone with your memories." "Safely miserable, you mean?" He kissed the top of her head. "Eleanor, you didn't just save the ranch. You gave me a reason to want tomorrow to come." That's a gift I can never repay. You already have, she said softly. You gave me a home, a family, a future. You gave me yourself. They stood together, watching the sun set over their land, their home, as their guests danced and celebrated. Into the night. Tomorrow would bring the work of building their life together, but tonight was for joy, for gratitude, for the miracle of two broken people who'd found wholeness in each other. 1 year later, Eleanor stood in the same spot where she'd first asked Jackson to marry her, but everything else had changed. The train platform bustled with new prosperity, families arriving to settle in the thriving community, goods flowing in and out of Cedar Ridge. Signs of the town's rebirth after Morrison's corruption had been rooted out. Eleanor rested her hand on her swelling belly, feeling the flutter of new life within. Jackson emerged from the freight office, the ledger in his hands, showing figures that would have seemed impossible a year ago. The ranch was thriving. The water rights, properly managed, now brought income that benefited the entire county. "The Hendersons are arriving on the afternoon train," he said, joining her. "Another family looking for a fresh start." "I remember that feeling," Eleanor murmured. Jackson's arm came around her, his hand joining hers over their growing child. "Mrs. Henderson is nervous," he continued, "coming sight unseen to marry a rancher she's only exchanged letters with." "Then we'll be there to meet them," Eleanor decided. No one should face that kind of fear alone. The past year had brought such changes. The house rang with laughter now, Mrs. Hayworth spoiling Eleanor like the daughter she'd never had. The ranch hands had built a school on Sterling land, where Eleanor taught the local children 3 days a week. Jackson had been elected to lead the county's new water board, ensuring fair distribution of resources, and through it all, their love had deepened, seasoned by shared work and quiet evenings, by challenges faced together and victories celebrated. Sarah's picture still hung in the parlor, honored but no longer a shrine. The past was acknowledged, the future embraced. "I have something for you," Jackson said, producing an envelope. "It arrived this morning." Eleanor recognized the handwriting. Immediately, Samuel Morrison, the man who'd fled rather than marry her. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "Dear Miss Whitmore," she read aloud, "I have learned of your marriage to Mr. Sterling and wish to extend my deepest apologies. My cowardice that day shames me still. I see now that fate had better plans for you than a union with a weak man such as myself. Please forgive me, and know that your courage in that moment has inspired me to be better. I wish you every happiness." Eleanor looked up at Jackson. "Should I reply? That's your choice, but I'd say the best response is to live well and be happy." He smiled. "Let him know by our example what he missed." She folded the letter decisively. "You're right, the past is past." Then, spotting movement at the station, "Oh, there's Mrs. Henderson." They watched a young woman step uncertainly onto the platform, clutching a single trunk, her face showing the same mixture of hope and fear Eleanor had worn a year ago. Without hesitation, Eleanor moved forward, Jackson beside her. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Eleanor Sterling, and this is my husband, Jackson. Welcome to Cedar Ridge." The relief on the young woman's face was palpable. "Mrs. Sterling, how kind of you to meet me. I'm so nervous." "Of course you are," Eleanor said warmly, taking her arm. "I stood on this very platform a year ago, just as frightened, but look how wonderfully things can turn out. Come, let's get you settled. Your intended is a good man. We've made sure of it. And if you need anything at all, Sterling Ranch is always open to you." As they helped Mrs. Henderson toward her new life, Eleanor caught Jackson's eye and smiled. The circle was complete, from desperate plea to generous welcome, from last resort to first choice in helping others. The sun was setting over Sterling Ranch, painting the sky in familiar shades of rose and gold. But now it wasn't an ending. It was a promise of all the tomorrows to come, filled with love, purpose, and the joy of a life fully lived.